Most rational species agreed that keeping apex predators in floating metal boxes was a terrible idea. Yet the xenobiological containment and study facility existed anyway, orbiting Theta 7 like a monument to institutional stubbornness. The xenobiological containment and study facility, orbiting the barren. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Rock known as Theta 7 housed approximately 200 specimens that would, and frequently did attempt to murder anything foolish enough to enter their enclosures. It was the kind of place where insurance companies refused to return calls and next-of-kin paperwork came pre-signed. The facility operated under what its director liked to call progressive scientific protocols, which was a fancy way of saying they'd run out of funding 3 cycles ago and couldn't afford proper safety equipment anymore. 17 species called this floating death trap home, though home implied a level of comfort that would have made the specimens laugh, assuming any of them possessed the anatomical structures necessary for laughter. The truly fascinating thing about the facility wasn't the collection of apex predators from various death worlds, nor the somewhat optimistic energy shields that separated them from the research staff. No, the interesting part was how every single civilization in the known galaxy had agreed upon one universal truth. There were beings who hunted, and beings who got hunted. Predators and prey. Teeth and meat. The eaters and the eaten. This binary classification had served galactic society remarkably well for approximately 40,000 standard years. It made diplomatic functions easier, prevented awkward seating arrangements at interstellar conferences, and generally kept the food chain from getting too philosophical about itself. Then humanity had shown up and ruined everything, as was their apparent specialty. The human currently standing in Enclosure 17 had no business being there. She had even less business doing what she was doing, which involved sitting cross-legged on the floor with a datapad, humming something that might have been music if music could be used as a weapon. Her containment suit hung unused on a hook by the entrance, because apparently protective equipment was for people who enjoyed not dying. The creature pacing around her measured roughly 2 meters at the shoulder and possessed enough teeth to open a dental clinic for other predators. Vrexians, according to the facility's catalog, came from a planet where the gravity was high, the prey was fast, and evolution had decided that subtlety was for species that wanted to go extinct. This particular Vrexian was young, barely past the cub stage, but still weighed approximately 140 kilograms of muscle, claw, and bad attitude. Its species had never developed space travel because they'd been too busy perfecting the art of ripping things apart. The Galactic Federation had discovered them during a survey mission and immediately classified them as Category 9 restricted predators, which meant even looking at pictures of them required signing liability waivers. The human didn't seem to have gotten that particular memo. "Your protein synthesis is off again," she muttered, tapping something on her datapad. "We're adjusting your diet tomorrow. Less of the Canthari meat substitute, more of the actual Canthari." The Vrexian cub circled closer, its 6 eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have sent most beings scrambling for the nearest panic button. Its breathing came out in huffs that condensed in the cooled air of the enclosure, each exhale demonstrating exactly why its homeworld had never developed prey species with functioning survival instincts. Then it did something that made the 3 researchers observing through the observation window simultaneously reach for their emergency communicators. It tried to climb into her lap. 140 kilograms of apex predator attempted to arrange itself on top of a human who weighed maybe 60 kilograms soaking wet. The physics were ambitious at best, catastrophic at worst. Claws the size of combat knives scraped against the floor as the creature attempted to achieve what could only be described as the worst seating arrangement in xenobiological history. The human looked up from her datapad, regarded the mass of teeth and murder attempting to use her as furniture, and sighed with the exasperation of someone whose coffee had gone cold rather than someone facing imminent disembowelment. "You're heavy," she said flatly. The Vrexian cub paused, processing this information with whatever passed for cognitive function in its predator brain. Then, demonstrating more emotional intelligence than most of the facility's staff gave it credit for, it settled down beside her instead. Its massive head rested approximately 3 centimeters from her thigh, close enough that each breath ruffled the fabric of her standard-issue jumpsuit. Up in the observation deck, junior researcher Kelthar made a sound that his species typically reserved for witnessing religious miracles or spectacular traffic accidents. His forearms flailed in a gesture that roughly translated to, "What in the name of all that's theoretically possible did we just witness?" That's not how predators work," he managed, his mandibles clicking with agitation. "That's not how any of this works." Senior researcher Ven, a being whose species had spent the last 6 million years perfecting the art of not getting eaten, slowly lowered her datapad. Her optical stalks swiveled between the observation window and her colleague with the jerky motion of someone whose worldview was actively collapsing. "File this under Unexplainable Human Phenomena, Category 7, Subsection Why Do We Even Bother?" she said, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd been working with the human for 3 months and had stopped being surprised 2.5 months ago. Down, in the enclosure, the human had returned to her datapad as if she hadn't just violated approximately 17 fundamental laws of xenobiology. The Vrexian cub's breathing had settled into a rhythmic pattern that the monitoring equipment was registering as contentment, which was impossible because apex predators didn't experience contentment unless they were actively digesting something they'd killed. "This is going in my resignation letter," Kelthar announced. "Right at the top, before the salutation. I quit because humans break reality." "That's the whole letter." "You can't quit," Ven replied, still staring at the scene below. "You signed a 3-year contract. I'll pay the penalty. I'll sell my housing pod. I'll become a monk. Anything is better than trying to write this up in a report that won't get me committed to a psychiatric facility." The human reached out absently, scratching behind one of the Vrexian's auditory membranes. The creature made a sound that the translators couldn't process, possibly because no one had ever bothered to record what a happy Vrexian sounded like. It was the audio equivalent of a rock slide learning to purr. "She's going to get eaten," Kelthar said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd been saying this for 3 months. The human remained stubbornly uneaten. "Maybe that's her defense mechanism," Ven suggested, grasping at theoretical straws. "Maybe humans evolved to be so confusing that predators just give up and take naps instead. That's not a defense mechanism, that's just rude to evolution." The facility's director chose that moment to materialize in the observation deck, which was less a dramatic entrance and more a testament to how quietly his species could move when they wanted to avoid being noticed by things with teeth. Director Zithal possessed the kind of rigid posture that came from being an insectoid species with an exoskeleton and a deeply ingrained respect for proper procedure. He observed the scene in Enclosure 17 with a particular stillness that suggested his internal organs were trying to decide whether to continue functioning. "Is that," he began, his translator adding a slight mechanical tremor that perfectly captured his emotional state, "the Category 9 restricted predator engaging in social bonding behavior?" "Yes, Director," Ven confirmed, because lying seemed pointless when the evidence was literally resting its massive head next to the human's leg. "And the human is doing her job, sir, monitoring behavioral patterns and physiological responses. While sitting on the floor, she says the monitoring equipment works better at close range. The monitoring equipment is rated for distances up to 50 meters. She has opinions about the manufacturer's specifications, sir." Director Zithal's antennae performed a complicated dance that roughly translated to several profanities that hadn't been invented yet. He'd hired the human because the facility desperately needed someone with actual xenobiological experience, and her credentials had been impeccable. Her resume had failed to mention that she treated Category 9 restricted predators like particularly large house cats. "I want a full report on my desk by end of cycle," he said finally. complete with theoretical frameworks for how this is possible without violating everything we know about predator-prey dynamics. Sir, Kelthar ventured, what if there is no theoretical framework? What if humans just do this? Director Zithal's antennae drooped, which was his species' equivalent of a heavy sigh. Then I want a report explaining why we bother having theories at all. He left the observation deck with as much dignity as someone could muster while contemplating the futility of scientific classification. Behind him, Ven and Kelthar returned to their monitoring stations, watching as the human continued her work with a deadly predator serving as the galaxy's most dangerous pillow. You know what the worst part is? Kelthar asked after a long silence. What? This isn't even the weirdest thing she's done this week. Ven checked her notes, found the entry about the human teaching the Crethian acid spitter to play fetch, and decided that maybe Kelthar had a point about that whole resignation letter thing. 3 months earlier, the human had arrived at the facility with 2 duffel bags, a concerning lack of survival instincts, and credentials that made Director Zithal weep with relief. The previous xenobiologist had lasted exactly 4 days before a Crethian acid spitter had demonstrated why its species name wasn't just creative marketing. The position had been vacant for 6 months because apparently high mortality rate wasn't a selling point in job postings. Her interview had been conducted via holoconference, which meant Director Zithal hadn't noticed certain warning signs, like how she'd answered his question about handling dangerous specimens while absent-mindedly petting something large and furry that occasionally wandered through the camera frame, or how she described Category 9 predators as big babies who just need proper socialization, which was roughly equivalent to calling a supernova a bit warm. The facility's AI had flagged 73 concerns about her psychological profile. Director Zithal had ignored all of them because the alternative was personally feeding the Rexian, and his life insurance policy had very specific exclusions about voluntary stupidity. She'd stepped off the transport shuttle, looked around at the reinforced containment cells, the emergency evacuation pods, and the memorial wall dedicated to researchers who'd made poor choices, and said, "Cozy." That should have been the first sign. The second sign came during orientation when she'd asked why the feeding protocols required remote delivery systems. They're living things, not bombs, she'd said, which demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the creatures in question. Several of them were, in fact, considerably more dangerous than standard munitions. By the end of her first week, she'd reorganized the feeding schedules, adjusted the environmental controls in half the enclosures, and somehow convinced the Crethian acid spitter to stop melting observation equipment. The staff had responded with a mixture of awe and terror, like watching someone juggle active plasma grenades while riding a unicycle. The aliens had tried to understand. They'd really tried. Junior researcher Kelthar had compiled a database of human behavioral patterns, cross-referencing them with known predator-prey dynamics, evolutionary psychology, and several religious texts that seemed tangentially relevant. The result was a document that raised more questions than it answered, and had been flagged by the station's mental health subroutines as potentially destabilizing to readers. "Look at this," he'd said to Ven during one of their increasingly desperate research sessions. His forearms gestured at a holographic display showing the human's daily routine. She enters enclosure 12 at 0600 hours. The Fantari ambush predator, which has successfully killed 3 remote drones and 2 servitor bots, waits until she sits down. Then it brings her its feeding bowl. Maybe it's planning something, Ven suggested without conviction. For 3 months? That's not ambush predation, that's just having a schedule. The footage showed the human checking the Fantari's teeth, examining its retractable claws, and running a scanner over its scaled hide while the creature sat there with the patience of a saint. A terrifying, 6-limbed saint with venom sacs and a documented kill count. But still, there has to be a logical explanation, Kelthar insisted, pulling up another file. Humans are classified as persistence predators. Their homeworld is rated Category 12 on the Death World Index. They evolved alongside megafauna that would give our specimens nightmares. You're saying she's scarier than the things we keep in cages? I'm saying, maybe the things in cages recognize something we don't. Ven's optical stalks twisted in the gesture her species used when contemplating uncomfortable truths. That's somehow worse than not having an explanation. The human's daily routine had become something of a spectator sport among the research staff. At 0600, she'd visit the Fantari. At 0700, the Rexian cub that had claimed her as its emotional support human. At 800, a crystalline predator from a high-gravity world that communicated through subsonic vibrations and had once shattered a containment field out of boredom. She talked to all of them. Actual conversations, as if they might respond with something other than murder attempts. Your mineral consumption is low, she'd told the crystalline creature while running a geological scanner across its faceted surface. We're adding silicate supplements to your next meal. The creature had hummed at a frequency that made the observation equipment rattle. The monitoring AI had translated this as contentment, then immediately filed a bug report about its own translation matrix because that couldn't possibly be correct. Director Zethal had watched these interactions with a growing suspicion that reality had taken a personal dislike to him. He'd spent 40 years in xenobiology, published extensively on predator behavior, and won awards for his work on containment protocols. None of that had prepared him for a human who treated his research station like a petting zoo. She's domesticating them, he'd said during an emergency staff meeting convened specifically to address the situation that nobody wanted to acknowledge. That's impossible, replied Dr. Thren, the station's xenopsychologist, whose species had 3 brains and still couldn't process what they were witnessing. Domestication requires generations of selective breeding and behavioral conditioning. She's been here 3 months. Then what do you call what's happening in Enclosure 17? Everyone looked at the live feed, where the Rexian cub was following the human around like a particularly deadly puppy. It carried a feeding bowl in its mouth, which shouldn't have been physically possible given its dental structure. Yet there it was, defying anatomy out of sheer determination. Statistically anomalous social bonding, Thren offered weakly. It's sleeping in her quarters, Zethal said flatly. The meeting room fell silent. Several researchers checked their audio implants, certain they'd misheard. The Vrexian, Zethal continued with the air of someone narrating their own descent into madness, has been observed entering her residential pod at approximately 2,200 hours each night. She has designated 14% of her living space as its sleeping area. She purchased a cushion from the station commissary, a cushion for a Category 9 restricted predator. That violates about 60 safety protocols, Kelthar said, frantically scrolling through regulations on his datapad. She filled out a pet authorization form. Those are for small, non-threatening companion animals. She listed the Vrexian as a large emotional support mammaloid and cited a medical exemption from her homeworld. Human resources approved it because apparently Earth classifies creatures that could kill you as therapeutic. Dr. Thren's 3 brains held a brief conference with each other. I need to add this to my research, one of them said through his primary mouth. No, wait, I need to quit, said another brain through his secondary mouth. The 3rd brain wisely remained silent. The human, meanwhile, continued her work blissfully unaware that she'd become the subject of intense academic debate. Or perhaps she was aware and simply didn't care, which was somehow more unsettling. She'd started bringing personal items into the enclosures. A portable music player that broadcast something called classical compositions, though the screeching violins sounded more like mating calls from an extinct predator species. The Vrexian seemed to enjoy it, which meant the universe had officially stopped making sense. Other specimens began responding to her presence in ways that made the research staff question their career choices. The Crethian acid spitter stopped spitting acid when she was around, as if it understood that dissolving her would be poor form. The Fantari ambush predator started bringing her interesting rocks it found in its enclosure, trading them for the treats she carried in her pockets. They're training her, Ven said one day, watching the footage with mounting horror. No, Kelthar corrected. She's training them. Look at the Fantari. It only gets treats after displaying non-aggressive behavior. That's operant conditioning. You can't use operant conditioning on apex predators. Apparently, you can if you're human and don't know it's impossible. The weight complaint had become legendary. The human had mentioned, in casual conversation with another staff member, that the Vrexian was getting too heavy for lap-sitting and needed to remember personal space boundaries. This statement had been overheard, recorded, and circulated through the facility's communication network with the speed of a catastrophic systems failure. Someone had made a meme. It showed the Vrexian species classification next to an image of the creature lying beside the human with a caption that read, "Rejected by lap, accepted by floor, still happy." Director Zethal had banned memes from the facility network. The memes persisted anyway, evolving and adapting like particularly resilient bacteria. The visiting inspector from the Galactic Federation's Xenobiological Ethics Committee arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad day because Tuesdays meant the Vrexian got its enclosure cleaned and became sulky about the disruption to its routine. The inspector, a rigid Valorian whose species treated protocol violations as moral sins, had come to verify the facility's compliance with containment standards. He'd lasted 30 minutes before witnessing the human hand feeding the Crethian acid spitter while explaining the importance of proper nutrition. That creature could dissolve her arm, the inspector managed, his translator adding a tremor that suggested internal screaming. Only if it wanted to, she'd replied cheerfully. But we have an understanding. The inspector had filed a report recommending the facility's immediate closure, the human psychological evaluation, and possibly a prayer to whatever deities governed sanity. Director Zethal had filed that report in the digital equivalent of a trash compactor and increased the human's salary, because here was the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Since she'd arrived, specimen health metrics had improved by 47%. Aggressive incidents had dropped to 0. Even the crystalline predator, which had been deteriorating from environmental stress, had stabilized. The human was good at her job, terrifyingly, impossibly good. She just happened to do it in ways that violated every known principle of xenobiology and made the research staff question whether they'd hallucinated their entire education. The revelation came during a routine data analysis session when Kelthar made the mistake of actually reading Earth's planetary classification report. Not the summary that human resources used for hiring purposes, but the full document, complete with ecological surveys, evolutionary history, and a threat assessment that read like a horror novel written by a pessimistic statistician. Category 12, he said aloud, his voice hollow. Earth is rated Category 12. Ven looked up from her terminal. We knew that already. No, you don't understand. I looked up what Category 12 means. He pulled up the classification criteria, his forearms trembling slightly. Hostile megafauna, check. Apex predators in every ecological niche, check. Venomous species numbering in the thousands, check. Parasites that can control host behavior. Catastrophic weather patterns, tectonic instability, and a gravity well that would crush most spacefaring species. Your point? Humans evolved by surviving everything that tried to kill them, which was everything. Their planet spent 4 billion years trying to murder its own inhabitants, and humans responded by climbing to the top of the food chain anyway. The implications settled over the observation deck like a lead blanket. Ven's optical stalks drooped as understanding dawned. So when she looks at the Vrexian, Ven said slowly, she's not seeing a Category 9 restricted predator. She's seeing something roughly equivalent to the wildlife she grew up around. Worse, I checked her personal file. She's from a continent called Australia. Is that significant? Kelthar pulled up Earth's geographical data. Australia is where Earth keeps the wildlife it made too dangerous for everywhere else. It's a Category 12 environment on a Category 12 planet. She's from the worst part of the worst planet, and she thinks our research station is cozy. The facility's AI chose that moment to chime in with a notification. The human had submitted a request to increase social enrichment time for the specimens. She'd attached a proposal suggesting group socialization sessions. She wants to introduce the predators to each other, Ven read, her voice faint. For playdates, Director Sighed appeared in the doorway, holding a datapad like it might explode. I just received communication from the Galactic Xenobiological Council. They want to send a research team to study her. To study the predators? Kelthar asked hopefully. No, to study her. They're proposing we reclassify humans. As what? Sighd's antennae performed a complicated gesture that loosely translated to existential despair. They haven't decided yet. The leading theory is apex social predator with reality distortion capabilities. Down in Enclosure 17, blissfully unaware of the academic crisis she'd triggered, the human was teaching the Vrexian cub to sit on command. The creature, which could theoretically disembowel a combat mech, sat promptly when she gestured. She rewarded it with a treat and a scratch behind its auditory membranes. The monitoring equipment registered contentment from the Vrexian, resignation from the research staff, and a system error from the classification database, which had given up trying to categorize what it was witnessing. I'm updating my resume, Kelthar announced. I'm listing survived working with humans as a special skill. That might actually be marketable, Ven agreed. The emergency session of the Xenobiological Ethics Committee convened via holoconference, which was fortunate because several members would have fled if they'd had to meet in person. 17 species represented, 43 individuals present, and one human sitting calmly in a conference room while a Vrexian cub dozed beside her chair. This is highly irregular, announced committee chair being Vexthal, whose species had evolved from prey animals and still carried that anxiety in every syllable. We're here to discuss the classification status of humanity based on recent behavioral observations. The human raised her hand. Can I ask what brought this on? You've domesticated a research facility full of apex predators in 3 months, Vexthal said flatly. That's either unprecedented scientific achievement or evidence that humans are significantly more dangerous than currently classified. I just treated them like pets. The committee members exchanged glances that ranged from confused to terrified. Pets, repeated Dr. Thren, attending remotely. Could you elaborate on what Earth considers appropriate pet species? Sure. Growing up, my family had dogs, cats, a couple of birds, some reptiles. My neighbor kept wolves. Another friend rehabilitated injured predators for wildlife services. Wolves, Vexthal said weakly. You're saying humans domesticate pack hunters? About 15,000 years ago, yeah. We've been doing it so long we've got hundreds of specialized breeds. Kelthar pulled up comparative data on his terminal. Wolves are Category 7 predators. Humans turned Category 7 predators into companions and genetically modified them for specific tasks. We also domesticated cats, which domesticated themselves, really, and horses and cattle and— Please stop, Vexthal interrupted. You're making this worse. The human shrugged, reaching down to scratch the Vrexian's head when it stirred. The creature made that impossible purring rock slide sound and settled back into sleep. The committee watched this interaction with the fascination of scientists observing a fundamental law of physics being casually violated. Here's what I don't understand, the human continued. Why is everyone so surprised? You hired me to work with dangerous animals. I work with dangerous animals. They're just animals. They need food, enrichment, social interaction, and consistent boundaries. They're apex predators. Someone protested from the back of the virtual conference room. So are humans, technically. We just use tools instead of teeth. The silence that followed was the sound of multiple worldviews crumbling simultaneously. Director Sighed cleared his throat. The committee needs to vote on reclassification. Current proposal suggests humans be designated as apex social predators with anomalous domestication capabilities. I prefer pretty good with animals, the human offered. That's not a scientific classification. Neither is reality distortion capabilities. But I heard that was on the table. Vexthal consulted his notes with the air of someone whose career had taken an unfortunate turn. The vote will proceed. All in favor of reclassifying humans as apex predators? Unanimous approval. Even the human voted yes, because apparently self-awareness wasn't going to stop her from being difficult. Motion to add approach with extreme caution to human diplomatic documentation. Also unanimous. Motion to increase the facility's budget so we can afford proper safety equipment that the human will inevitably ignore. Director Sighed voted yes, so enthusiastically his hologram flickered. The meeting adjourned with new regulations, updated classification protocols, and a general sense that the galaxy had just acknowledged something it had been desperately trying to ignore. Humans weren't just persistence predators from a death world. They were persistence predators who decided that other predators made excellent friends, and they'd brought that attitude to the stars. The human returned to her quarters with the Vrexian following faithfully behind. She'd filed the adoption paperwork that morning, complete with medical records, dietary requirements, and a comprehensive care plan that the station's legal department had approved while drinking heavily. Somewhere in the facility's database, her personnel file received an updated classification tag. Next to her name, her species designation, and her job title, a new entry appeared. Reason why we can't have nice taxonomies. Kelthar saw it during his evening data review and laughed until his supervisor threatened to revoke his coffee privileges. The facility continued operating. Specimens thrived under the humans' inexplicable care, and the galaxy quietly added humans to the very short list of species that made everyone else nervous at diplomatic functions. 3 weeks later, the humans submitted a proposal for expanding the facility's breeding program. Director Zithal read the first paragraph, poured himself something alcoholic, and approved it without reading further. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially against someone who'd convinced the universe's most dangerous creatures that she was worth protecting instead of eating. The Vrexian cub, now officially registered as her companion animal, had zero opinions on galactic classification systems. It had a comfortable sleeping spot, regular meals, and a human who scratched behind its ears. From its perspective, the arrangement was perfect. The rest of the galaxy would just have to adjust.